Is Dr. Buffano. Welcome to my lecture on an introduction to Latin American politics. Just to introduce this class, I'm going to be, over the next several months, posting lectures on various aspects of Latin American politics. I myself am a comparativist. I compare countries across the globe to understand differences and similarities. Why are some countries democracies and others dictatorships? Why are some countries more economically developed than others? I also specialize in international relations, looking at power dynamics between different countries. Why do wars break out? And what types of influences do countries have on each other? I've also done a lot of work on migration policy, for example. So I've have previous lectures on my channel on things like Middle East politics, for example. And in this class, we're going to specifically look at Latin America. Now, in this introductory lecture, I'm going to introduce what exactly is Latin America, right? Why treat this part of the world as a region? Right? So there's a lot of things it has in common. We're also going to look at the similarities and differences across Latin America. Why are some countries democracies and dictatorships in the region across time and space? Why do levels of economic development vary, and so on and so forth? I'm going to introduce to you some very basic differences across the region. And we're also going to understand why the region matters for international relations. Latin America has been influenced by other regions of the world, such as Europe, so Spain, France, the Portuguese, the English have had a great influence on this part of the world. On top of that, as well, of course, in more recent history, the United States has had a great influence on the foreign policy of Latin America, and a controversial one. So we're going to understand why this region matters for IR studies and for American foreign policy more specifically. All right, so let's get to it. What exactly is Latin America? Well, Latin America consists of countries that were colonized by Latin-speaking countries in Europe, specifically the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French. And as you can see here, we consider these countries that are south of the United States to be colonized by these countries to be part of Latin America. Now, not every single country that's south of the United States is considered part of Latin America. So, for example, this little country Belize here, as well as this island Jamaica, they were English colonies. So we're not going to talk about these countries much within this class. And of course, the Dutch as well had their own colonies in the Caribbean. These countries are not going to be part really of the discussion on Latin America, okay? But most of them are. So from Mexico here all the way down south to Chile and Argentina, most of these countries here are generally considered part of a region of the world we call Latin America. And the reason why one of the big reasons it has this term is because most of these countries were colonized by what we call Latin speaking countries. So the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French were the big colonizers, but there's other Latin speaking countries such as Italy and Romania. As you can see, they're found on the European continent. During the days of the Roman Empire, about 2,000 years ago, Latin was the written language of most of the Roman elites. And after the Roman Empire collapsed, eventually new countries later in history formed in its wake, including Spain, Portugal, and France. All of them speak various derivations of the Latin language. So they have a lot of words and phrases in common. They also have a lot in common culturally with one another. So just take a look here at just a list of words from these different languages. So we've got, the Latin language of the Roman Empire, this formal written language. Then we got Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian here. And notice with common words like sun, man, body, moon, night, well, year, good, and life, they all have a lot in common, right? So the word for life in Latin is vida. It's vida in Spanish, vida in Portuguese, vida in French, and so on and so forth, right? So they have a lot in common with each other here. And they also as well have a relatively common colonial history. So Spain was the big conqueror here. Starting in 1492, the Spanish established this massive empire across Latin America and even included parts of the United States as well, what would become the United States, such as Florida, for example. So they established this massive empire. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Peru would become part of this massive Spanish empire. But they weren't the only colonizers here. So while Portugal really only had one major colony in this region, it was a big colony, that of Brazil. Brazil is the largest country in the region, it was the crown jewel of the Portuguese Empire, very important country in this region, and even in global politics today. Finally, France also had colonies in parts of both North and South America, although not as important of a colonial player here in Latin America. They did, though, have a few colonies such as Haiti and a bunch of smaller Caribbean islands. So we're going to be talking a lot about Haiti in this class, very important country within this region. And these countries brought some similar things to Latin America with them. They brought the Catholic faith. They brought this hierarchical religious faith, Catholicism. So, and of course, this means that the Pope in Rome has an important cultural influence on Latin America today. These countries as well also brought a monarchical heritage with them. Now, this is very different from the 13 colonies of the English, who brought with them Protestantism. And while, of course, there was some monarchical influence there, they also brought the politics of parliamentary democracy with them as well. So the English colonies, the 13 colonies, had a very different history from the colonies of Latin America. And so we're going to talk a lot about that in this class, as well as how these different colonial heritages impacted these different parts of the world. Now, while Latin America has these things in common, we do have to be very careful about overgeneralizing about a region. First off, the European heritage is not the only thing that matters with Latin America. When the Europeans came to the Americas, they encountered indigenous peoples who continue to have an impact on the politics and the culture of the region. These peoples speak their own languages, they have their own cultural heritage, they have their own influences in the politics of this part of the world. And as you can see, their influence also varies across countries. So, for example, in Brazil, indigenous peoples consist of less than 1% of the population. In Mexico, they're about 15%. In Guatemala, they're 41%. And if you go, for example, to Bolivia, they're over 60% of the population. On top of that, a lot of the Spanish and Portuguese that came to the New World, they ended up intermarrying with many of these indigenous peoples, having mixed families, and their cultural heritages got mixed. And this mixed heritage we know as mestizo culture. So these indigenous peoples matter. They have an influence on the politics. Now, on top of that as well, the Europeans in various countries, just as what happened in North America, they brought a lot of slaves from West Africa to engage in things like mining and in cash crop farming in different parts of the region. So these Black African populations came to exist in Latin America as well. And so in Brazil, they consist of about 10% of the population. In fact, about 5 million slaves were brought over to Brazil. Now, in other countries, they only consist of much smaller minorities. But in the case of Haiti, for example, 90% of the people during the French colonial era were Black African slaves. And so, of course, this would have a big influence on Haiti's politics. So as you can see here, this played an important role in Latin American politics as well. Now, just to add more complexity here to this, there isn't a clear 100% dividing line between Latin America and North America, or between the United States and Latin America. There is some overlap here. As I stated, the Spanish had a lot of influence on what would become the United States. Florida was initially a Spanish colony, as were the parts of the United States that are part of the Southwest, like Texas, California, New Mexico. And in fact, a large percentage of the population in these southern states have Latino populations to this day. So California, for example, over 30% consists of an Hispanic population. Florida, over 20% consists of an Hispanic population. So this played an important role in American politics as well, this colonization. And in fact, Puerto Rico would eventually be annexed by the United States. It was a Spanish colony. We're going to be talking a lot about Puerto Rico in here. So there's a lot of overlap between these different parts of the world, and migration continues to take place until this very day. Now, on top of this as well, there was a lot of political diversity within Latin America, which makes it important for comparative political scientists to want to understand, for example, why some countries are democracies and others are dictatorships. So we're going to be spending a lot of this class comparing what we call regimes. Now, a regime is the rules of the game that determine who gets into power and why. Latin America has a history of having monarchies, personalistic dictatorships, military dictatorships, single party regimes, electoral authoritarian regimes, and democracies. So we're going to be talking about these different types of regimes, why they emerged, when they emerged, and why there's variation across time and space. And so we'll talk a lot about the European colonial era and differences between colonies, that were controlled by Brazil and Spain and France from the late 15th to the 19th centuries. Now, we're also going to talk as well about the regimes that emerged after independence. And in fact, from independence to about the 1970s, most of these countries were dictatorships at various points in time, although the nature of their dictatorships vary. So in the first half century or so after independence, there were a lot of failed states, a lot of socioeconomic and political instability in Latin America. A lot of these countries had these personalistic military dictatorships across the region. And so we're going to understand why these different types of regimes emerged. Now, by the late 19th century, some stability did begin to emerge in Latin America. Some countries transitioned to these limited forms of democracy, where the right to vote was mainly restricted to male property owners. So we get what are called limited democracies throughout Latin America in the late 19th and early 20th century. There were also some military dictatorships. A lot of these countries, their governments were propped up by the United States. They're called banana republics. We're going to talk about them more later in the semester. Now, during the Cold War era, in the middle of the 20th century, there were also a lot of military dictatorships due to the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for political power. So during the Great Depression and the Cold War, lots of military dictatorships during this era. Now, this has begun to change, though. From the late 1970s and the 1980s to the present, a lot of democracies spread throughout the region. In fact, most of the countries in the region are going to transition to some form of democracy by the 1990s. So this is known as the third wave of democratization. Now, of course, these democracies do have a lot of common flaws. There's a lot of common struggles. A lot of these countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, they have problems with a lot of corruption within their political systems and clientelism, problems with economic inequality, problems as well with the marginalization of ethnic and racial minorities. They also as well tend to have very powerful executives, powerful presidents, and some problems as well with political violence, such as issues with drug cartels. And there's also as well been some issues of recent cases of democratic backsliding in places like Venezuela. And there are a few cases that never transitioned to democracy to begin with, like Cuba and Haiti, for example. But with that said, there have been a lot of countries that have transitioned to democracies, and some have become very substantive democracies, such as Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. So we're going to try to understand, why does this variation exist across the region? By the way, here is a map of the different regime types across the region according to the democracy index. As you can see, our strongest democracies are in Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. Very competitive elections, a robust middle class, a strong civil society. Other countries have elections, but there are also sorts of flaws with the electoral process. And so we'll be talking about countries like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico here, Bolivia, Peru have systems with a lot of flaws here. And finally, you can see here Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti continue to suffer from problems with just pure authoritarianism, where there's no competition at all within these political systems. Now, these countries as well differ in terms of socioeconomic development. So we can compare countries economically. Most of these countries tend to be what's called middle income countries. That is, they're between $5,000 to $15,000 a year. They tend to be wealthier than countries on the African continent, which tend to have incomes that are below $2,000 a year, but they tend to be poorer than economically developed countries such as the United States, Germany, France, Japan. Now, with that said, there are some exceptions to this. So Haiti is a very poor country. The average person earns less than $2,000 a year, whereas Uruguay, the average person earns approximately $23,000 per year per capita. And so there are some differences across the region. There's also high rates of economic inequality within this region. So in places like Mexico, for example, northern Mexico is relatively well developed economically, whereas the far south is relatively poor in comparison. There's also differences across ethnic groups and racial groups in the region, as well as between urban and rural areas. Now, some countries in the region as well have industrialized, and there are industrial centers in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Uruguay. Others remain very poor and what we call rentier states, heavily dependent on oil or mineral resources or cash crops. And so countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru tend to be poor, less economically developed. And so we're going to look at why this variation exists across Latin America. Once again, here is a map of this region of the world. And as you can see, while they all tend to be clustered in these kind of middle income countries, there are some differences. And what makes them interesting as well as middle income countries is that, their democracies and dictatorships have tended to be less stable. The poorest countries in the world tend to be stable dictatorships, whereas the richest tend to be democracies, but those in the middle have a lot of fluctuation. There's been a lot of transitions in recent history in this part of the world. It makes Latin America interesting to study for regime transitions as a result. Now, we're also going to be studying Latin America to understand changes in international relations, not only looking at colonialism, but the American imperialist era. During the 1800s, while Latin American countries were struggling after independence with political and economic stability, America industrialized and eventually by the early 20th century became the world's largest economy and began to influence the politics of Latin America in various ways, some ways that are deemed negative, others that are deemed positive, depending on what perspective you come from. Very controversial influence. In fact, parts of, as I said, the United States were actually initially part of Latin America. They were Spanish colonies. So America annexed Florida in 1819 and annexed Texas in 1845. The United States also went to war with Mexico, a 3-year war that eventually led to the United States seceding a little less than half of Mexico's territory. So California was once part of Mexico. That's why we have cities like in California, like Los Angeles, San Francisco. Those are Spanish names. In Texas, we have San Antonio. And in Florida, right, we have tons of cities with Spanish names like Miami. And this kind of conquest would continue. So in 1898, America had this very important war with Spain. Spain lost what little was left of their colonial empires in the Caribbean. In 1898, the United States took Cuba, They took the Philippines, which is located in the Pacific. They also took as well the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico from the Spanish. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it became a direct colony of the United States. It still is a colony. The United States would have a great influence on Cuban and the Dominican Republic's politics going forward. So, as I said, Puerto Rico was annexed. On top of that, the United States as well began engaging in what's called neo-imperialism in other parts of Latin America, especially Central America, for a variety of different reasons. Not only was it geographically more closer to the United States than other parts of Latin America, but there was an opportunity to build a canal in Central America that would connect the Pacific with Atlantic Oceans and cut down naval trade, okay, across the globe. And so thus in 1914, a canal was completed in a country called Panama. In fact, in order to complete that canal, the United States had to encourage a rebellion in the Panamese region of Colombia. So Panama became an independent country because of American imperial influence. In 1914, a canal was created there. In fact, the United States controlled this canal for many decades afterwards. And in fact, the United States would have all sorts of an influence on other countries in the region. The United States was interested in extracting cash crops like cocoa, coffee, cash crops like bananas, for example, from this part of the world, as well as mineral resources such as copper, such as things like gold and silver from this part of the world, and bringing it back to the United States. And they were not interested in promoting industrialization in these countries. They didn't want these countries competing with the United States over industry. So the United States played a role in overthrowing many governments during this era, backing up a lot of whether it was democratically elected governments or dictatorships, and influencing their foreign policies, often forcing them to open up for free trade with the United States. And so in this class, we're going to try to understand why the United States was more powerful than Latin America and what type of impact that it had on the region. Not all of these influences were necessarily negative. The United States as well also influenced eventually the spread of democracy to Latin America, and also had a great influence on many of the social movements across the region. And by the way, this map provides a nice kind of overview of this neo-imperial era in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as you can see, there was scarcely a country that wasn't touched by this imperialism in Latin America during this era, right? So countries like Panama, Mexico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, very much influenced by the USA. Very controversial. And this influence would continue during the course of the Cold War. But another political player would be influenced to this region during this era, the Soviet Union and their communist far left ideology. In fact, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States competed to try to influence the politics of the region. While the United States wanted to spread capitalism, right-wing political and economic policies throughout the region, the Soviet Union wanted to spread labor union activism, far left-wing politics, and the redistribution of wealth to impoverished communities. And in fact, the Soviet Union either inspired or supported class-based revolutions and insurgencies in different parts of the world. We're going to talk a lot about how far leftist ideologies influence countries like Cuba and Guatemala in this class, how it influenced Venezuela in other parts of the region. So in 1958, Cuba had a far left revolution, and eventually those revolutionaries overthrew a pro-Western government and established a single-party dictatorship that eventually embraced a communist ideology under the rule of Fidel Castro. But the United States, for its part, also supported its own insurgencies and military coups and overthrew a bunch of governments. And so, for example, the U.S. overthrew a left-wing government in Chile in 1973 and installed a military dictatorship led by Augusto Pinochet. So these countries had a big influence on Latin America's politics, a very controversial one, because there were also numerous insurgencies and civil wars in places like Nicaragua, Salvador, Guatemala, and elsewhere that in many cases have devastating impact on this region of the world economically and politically. Also created a lot of the migration crises that in many ways still impact the region today. Now, when the Soviet Union declined, though, and eventually the Cold War came to an end, the world really experienced what was known as the third wave of democratization. The United States became less willing to support military dictatorships in the region, and the far left no longer had the support from the Soviet Union. So left and right-wing political parties in the region tended to moderate their rhetoric and behavior, and the United States engaged in a lot of democracy promotion. In fact, most of the countries in the region became democracies during this era, although many have had a lot of frauds. So the United States promoted very heavily and continued to promote capitalism and neoliberalism. It won out in that Cold War struggle. And a lot of countries ended up reopening their economies to free trade with the United States. So, for example, in 1994, Mexico signed the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Canada. And thus, you begin to see a great increase in the amount of trade with Latin America and North America during this era. And there's a lot of controversies with this free trade. And so some scholars have argued it created a lot of economic growth and some prosperity in some circles. Places like northern Mexico had a lot of growth, Silicon Valley in California. But others argued as well that it led to a lot of economic inequality and poverty. Places like southern Mexico, for example, became heavily impoverished. It also had arguably a negative impact on the auto industry in the Midwest in the United States. So we'll be talking about the free trade agreement, NAFTA, and other free trade agreements in the region. The United States as well began to have a very heavy impact on international relations in Latin America. They supported international organizations like the Organization of American States, and they promoted their pro-capitalist sort of agenda through these international organizations. And so we're going to talk about what the impact of the United States is on Latin America in the present, as well as the positives and negatives of this impact, as well as how this relationship has impacted the United States. And by the way, this impact was quite extensive. This chart here is showing there are over 50 examples of U.S. military interventions in Latin America during the Cold War, right? So you cannot understand Latin American politics without understanding American foreign policy. And last important thing here as well is we're going to be talking a lot about mass migration and the movements of cultures and how this impacted both Latin America and the United States. There is, of course, a history of mass migration to the United States from Latin America, and this intensified from the 1970s to the 2000s due to globalization, and as well as those Cold War conflicts I talked about. Now, this migration, though, does vary from country by country and time period, right? There are different reasons why different countries witness the immigration of migrants from Latin America to the United States. So we'll talk about why these different periods of mass migration happened and what impact they had on both the United States and Latin America. And once again, there's lots of debates about the positive and negative impacts. Some scholars argue that it led to a lot of economic growth and prosperity. It also helped with increasing trade as well. It led to a lot of cultural diffusion. But others argue as well that it had some negative impacts, such as, the emergence and growth of the drug trade, for example, and the growth of narcotics to the United States, as well as the movement of guns from the United States to Latin America, that it may have intensified the political violence within Latin America as a result of this. And, as you can see on this chart, there's been a lot of migration from Latin America to the United States, but there are differences across countries. There's been very little migration, for example, from Brazil to the United States in comparison with countries such as Mexico, Cuba, or Puerto Rico. Okay. And of course, Puerto Rico in 1898 would actually become part of the United States, right? So as a result of that, there are a lot of Puerto Ricans on the mainland United States today. There's been less migration from South America in contrast, although there are some exceptions to this. Venezuela and Colombia have had a lot of migration in recent history. And by the way, this is just showing the major trafficking routes of things like cocaine and heroin. So if you're interested in narcos and you're interested, for example, in the Cali cartel or the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, we're going to be talking a lot about these different cartels from this part of the world. And by the way, while a lot of drugs did flow north to the United States, as I said, a lot of guns did flow down to the south. So we'll be talking a lot about that. All right, that does it for this lecture on Latin American politics. If you have any questions for me, feel free to ask below or any criticisms. I know I had to simplify this region a lot just to kind of introduce to it. I know there are a lot more complexities, so don't worry, we're going to get into some of those complex dynamics throughout this course. I'll see you all next time. We will be discussing next class differences in the indigenous communities of this region prior to Spanish colonization. So I will see you all next time.